Okay, I think we're all here. So we'll call this meeting to order. It is the day after Cinco de Mayo, March 6th, 2024. The time is 1:31 p.m. We're in the offices of the Public Service Commission in the Bollinger Room, and we're assembled here for the commission to become acquainted with Northwestern Energy's plans for wildfire mitigation. With me is Commissioner Brown, President Commissioner Brown. Okay. Also, I see Vice President Fielder is with us. Can you hear us, Vice President?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
And I don't know of any others that are online. And Commissioner Bukacek, I understand, is on her way. So with that, we turn it over to Northwestern.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell and President Brown and Vice President Fielder. Good to get a chance to talk with you today. Obviously, it's a very important topic in the utility space these days. We've had, as you know, from the last rate review, a fire plan in place, and I'd argue we've been, and Jason Merkel will speak to a great portion of this presentation, we've been dealing with wildfire for as long as we've been in business, and that's been 100 years. Things have changed a bit on two fronts. From my perspective, certainly our fire season's gotten longer. And so how we deal with that longer fire season and the steps we need to take is certainly an important step, and we'll talk about that today. But also just the litigious nature of any time there is a fire. Obviously, what we've seen in other jurisdictions actually have threatened the health of utilities. And so all of us are doing some things slightly different than we've done in the past. And I'd argue that what we have in this plan here, I would say in terms of where we sit versus other utilities, particular for our service territory, feel very, very good of what we've accomplished certainly in the last 4 years in terms of our last plan and in this plan. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Merkel and his team here to kind of give you a presentation on this very important topic. Thank you.
Introduce you. Well, thank you, Brian. I will. Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm Jason Merkel. I'm the Vice President of Distribution. And with me today, we have Nate Linder. He's actually our Director of Wildfire Operations. That was a new position. Actually, we just formed at the beginning of the year. His whole team is largely focused on this effort. And then also Brandy Hellwinkle. She's out of our manager of our asset management group. And it's a lot of her group that studies and analyzes and determines our strategic direction. I'll jump right in with this, but
before you do, Mr. Merkel, can you please just make sure to snug that microphone right up to you, because if you turn your head away from it a little bit, it fades really fast.
Very good.
Thank you.
And we'll put that one on the record. That was the first time I've ever not been heard, I think. So, but thank you, Vice President Fielder. We'll jump into this. What I'm hoping today, though, commissioners, if you would allow this to be a bit of a conversation, and if there's something of note as I'm moving through this, please stop me and let's talk about it at the time. You'll see that there's a number of slides to get through, but a lot of them will move through fairly quickly. So starting off, please. We're getting the deck before us here. Yes. Yeah, I know I do. Okay. Very good. You can advance. Okay. Vice President Fielder, are you good?
Yeah, I'm good. And I can also see.
Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, I'll dive into this. I'm on slide 3 and these are a bit of the headlines that have become the landscape for wildfire in the utilities, specifically in the West. Obviously with Maui last summer, very tragic event. But even since then, there's been a number of activities, some more headlines that we could put on that slide. The wildfires that occurred in Texas involving utilities there. And then just most recently, Xcel Energy had some activity going on in the Colorado area where they actually coordinated a public safety power shutoff, and I'll get into more of that subject later. But this truly is the landscape. It's in my 30 years. It's incredible on how this has grown in the last 4 or 5 and became the discussion that I spend a good amount of my time on.
Let me ask, you mentioned 30 years. Can you talk a little bit about your qualifications and what you've done in that 30 years and how it leads you to this position?
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. I started with the company in 1993 for, at that time, Montana Power. And I was in the gas production that we had near Cut Bank, and also worked with the gas transmission group. Moved into hydro, and then in the late 90s, just prior to the asset sale, moved into distribution. And I moved to the Helen area. I was a division engineer, performing new connects and engineering maintenance projects for both gas and electric. And then ultimately moved into the management role. I was actually the division manager in the Helena division. And since then, in 2007, moved in to a position of general manager for Northwestern Energy. I first oversaw all of the operations divisions in Montana. Ultimately, a few years later, picked up both South Dakota and Nebraska. In September of 2022, became vice president. That's a bit of my background. Thank you for the question. So this slide, it really does do a nice job of describing the increased wildfire risk. At the center of that slide, that's actually a slide our team put together just by our experience, showing the difference between the historical fire period in weeks. Typically, we were mid-June, you could start seeing them. And by the time you got to about that second football game in the fall, high school football game, it was usually behind you. We now experience fires in April and as we and even into late into December. So this really is increasing in terms of a year-round threat. When you look at that upper right, you'll see that the area that encompasses the majority of Montana is that darkest color, meaning the propensity to increase in length of season is upwards of 600%. So what we once enjoyed, maybe a 6-week fire season, that would suggest that we're looking at potentially 36 weeks. When you look at the far west coast, you would think, well, California has fires all the time. Well, that's because there's not much red there. It's because they're already experiencing a fire season of 52 weeks, and there's really no room for expansion. So that's how you read that chart. The chart in the left, I'm not going to get into, but it talks about fuel aridity and how that is increased in and impacts the slides I just talked about. We'll get into that question. when we talk about risks, there's a number of ways to look at it. And within the utility space, one way to that question is the Forest Service has what's called a wildfire hazard potential. That's driven largely about the propensity of fuels to burn. That's the way I would look at the majority of that at that potential, at that risk. And overlaid on that green map of Montana, the green and yellow would suggest areas of very low, and the yellow being in the moderate. The blue lines that are scattered across that represent both our electric transmission as well as our distribution system. Well, there's a bit of a good news story there, and I'll get into the details of that. But the good news story is in terms of that area is still burnable. I mean, it's grasses, it'll burn. But in terms of the high fire consequence, those areas tend to be more where the forests are. You'll see we blew up the Bitterroot there. Having grown up over there, I know the valley well. And I also know that much of our distribution and transmission actually exists in those irrigated fields in along the Bitterroot River there. And at least for that region, constitute the majority of the spaces in the moderate to low portions of those regions. So in total, and I'll talk more to these statistics, there really is a small percentage, even given the vastness of our distribution and transmission system. The other map of the United States there, the dark color showing Montana, Wyoming, New Mexico, and some states to the east. That represents that all new construction, or better than 60% of new construction, is occurring in the WUI. Homes are being built in that wildfire urban interface. So that also shows and underscores the increase in the threat. This next slide shows a little bit of a journey of where we've been in terms of our historical investments. As Brian stated, we've been in the wildfire space for some time. And when we look at, there's a couple areas as we compared ourselves to other utilities, and I'll get into those details in a little bit. But the one area that, two areas actually, I'm very proud of what the company has done by comparison to other utilities, is we started early in our asset hardening. We were performing asset hardening before other utilities in the context of wildfire had really given it a name. We initially started with a period of what we call asset stabilization, where we were looking at the performance of our assets and addressing aging issues, performance issues during that period. We called those programs, I'm sure some of you will recall, we went through a period DSIP and TSIP and SSIP, which are system integrity plans for distribution, transmission, and substation. And those plans, even though they at the time were probably derived and with the intention of improved reliability, when it comes to reducing the potential for fire ignition, reliability and reduced fire potential run a parallel course. In both cases, you're looking to reduce a fault or an outage or an interruption on the system. And from the fire perspective, that's what will ignite the fires. And then we moved from about the 2018 period, and we're still doing all of these programs today. In fact, since our last rate filing, accelerated the programs that I'm talking about. The next phase was what we deemed as modernization. We started once the assets were improved. We looked at applying technology to give us better awareness, operation, and control of the systems. We put communication to the majority of our distribution substations, and we've been focusing on upgrading devices, protective devices from old electromechanical to microprocessor. And I'll get into some numbers a bit later as well. And then finally, we entered the phase where we were focused primarily on wildfire risk reduction, and that's what we're in today. One of the major programs, again, that I'm very proud of, leading most of our Northwest utility peers, was in the area of hazard tree and vegetation management. We've done a nice job with our right-of-ways. We continue to do that. And the hazard tree program allowed us to deal with dead, dying, and diseased trees outside of our right-of-way. Our issue became that given the width of our right-of-ways, we could have as a well-maintained, cleaned, manicured right-of-way. And if the trees were tall enough adjacent to us, they were still going to pose us an issue. That whole program was designed to go after those threats outside of our right-of-way. We worked with, developed incredible relationships with the Forest Service and other agencies in cooperation to go after those trees. The mountain pine beetle epidemic was a large driver of that program. But since then, we've had other infestations, such as the spruce budworm and others that it's work in progress. It seems like we deal with one and the next infestation rolls in. Last but not least, up there is the forest management program. And the forest management program, I'm going to talk more about that, but the data group out of Brandy's team have an approach to determine from a prioritized perspective what we need to go after. And instead of a time-based type maintenance program, we're actually now predictive. What is going to be, what's expected to be our problems. And our approach is to go after the areas in the highest risk and that we expect would be the largest problem for us from a wildfire perspective. I'll talk a little more detail about that in a bit. The next slide is really the basis of how we got into the wildfire mitigation plan. This is the foundation of it. California, given that they started actually, San Diego had a significant fire in the year 2007, and it really began to kick off where the industry went. And when that fire occurred, there were some other fires that occurred thereafter in more Northern California. And they really started working their way towards this industry standard of care, this wildfire mitigation plan, and heavily driven as the result or in reaction to large events. In 2019 and rolling into 2020, we began to work in partnership with our Northwest utilities because and I would say correctly, we're different than California. We have different issues, different problems, and we were at a different place. And we began to work together to understand how do we compare against each other. And we started there. And that's where I can say that a couple of the programs, the categories, if you will, that are in the wildfire plan, hardening, vegetation management, that's where I learned we were in a good place. We were at least at par with our peers and often leading in those two categories. The other categories that you'll learn more about: situational awareness, operational practice, and public outreach. Those three categories, we were at par with the Northwest, but we were way behind with California. And it started to become obvious that we needed to put some effort and some work in those areas. So in 2021, we began the work of developing what was called the Enhanced Wildfire Plan. Next slide. And this timeline's all of what I'm describing now, but in 2021, we started doing the development work for what is now, or what was, the Enhanced Wildfire Mitigation Plan. And that plan really focused on, we've been doing all this work, especially in the system hardening and the vegetation management arena for over a decade. What do we need to focus on incremental above that to enhance our wildfire effort? So the first draft of the wildfire mitigation plan really focused on the enhancements, the incremental. And then lastly, I will also say that particular plan did not have a PSPS element. In fact, we stated very clearly in that public safety power shutoff, we did not have that element within that plan. So 2024, it actually went on the website, our external website today, is the 2024 version of our wildfire mitigation plan. I'm proud of the work that the asset management group did in putting that plan together. It is a more comprehensive explanation of all things that we do wildfire, historic, what we're doing currently, and it also has a look of visionary, what we expect to do in the years to come. Much more comprehensive document than the first one. That one was very specific to, this is what we need to really embark into the wildfire space. We went through that in the 2022 rate filing, and were able to defer expenses, and that really gave us a good head start into what we needed to advance with. The last component that was with that was, again, PSPS, and I'm going to talk more about that, so I'll get to that here in a bit. This next slide, I'm going to hit this quickly. The only point I really want you to take away from this slide is that the plan that we now have, 2024, it absolutely meets that EEI industry standard. It has the components that the Edison Electric Institute, and it puts together its recommendation of what a plan should contain. So when we wrote 2024, we definitely wrote it to meet the standards with EEI. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into the plan itself and talk specific to the elements of the plan. Next slide. The objectives are this simple. We're looking to conduct our activities that reduce the ignition potential of our system. We want to enhance our ability to both understand the operation of our system, how it's operating when we're not there. We want to be able to watch it, and we want the technology in place that allows us that visibility, and not only our system but also the environment. We want to continue and build on the good practices that we've had in the vegetation management arena. And then last but not least, this particular issue is a state issue. It's not a utility issue. Wildfire is something that the whole state needs to, from a many different fronts. I feel at times that perhaps we're a bit of frogs in boiling water. And we need to understand the growing risks that this has to our customers, the public, and the good citizens of Montana. So the public communication and outreach is an important component of this. Not only communicate what the issue is, but also to communicate what we're doing about this issue and how we're partnering with so many within the state to alleviate the risk. The next slide. This is a wonderful slide these days, guys. Thank you for this. We did some modifications to this slide. And what it should show you is that the entire matrix is the plan. And the plan, even though there's 4 objectives, there's 5 categories that are spoke about within that plan. I've been talking to situational awareness, kind of comes with the name. We want to understand the system. We want to understand the environmental conditions. Operational practices, that's how we choose to operate our system, and also how we choose to do work on our system with our workers. System preparedness, that's all that work hardening, or excuse me, system hardening, and also the addition of technology for a better operating system, vegetation management, and communication outreach. As you look across that matrix of objectives, you can see which objectives we touch with each one of those categories. So now I'm going to go into each category, spend just a little bit of time and share with you what we've been doing, what we're doing. There might be some visionary statements to this, but not many. Most of what I'm sharing with you today is already in action. So first, in situational awareness, one of the biggest changes that we did initially was actually formalized a dedicated team. I told you that my comrade here, Nate Linder, he's our director of wildfire operations. He has a team within his department that it solely focuses on situational awareness. Largely, it's on the environmental component. The operations side of the business focuses on the operation, but we also they're also looking at how we align with our operations of our system with those environmental conditions. So he's a bit of that. His team is a bit of that check and balance. The one thing that I'm really excited about are the dynamic tools, model tools that we've put in place. I'll talk specifically about that. And then we're also enhancing the weather information because PSPS and so much what we do, it really is centered largely around wind. And so that's a variable that we need to have a good eye on. And then last but not least, we're doing some really good things, I think, for not only our customers, but the public in the form of placing cameras for early detection starts across the state. And I'll touch on that in more detail. So let's talk a little bit about that situational awareness. This is what the team has done. This slide, very detailed slide, so I'm not even going to ask you to. What I want you to pull out of this slide is you see Montana, you see our distribution system, and what you'll see are 3 colors. You'll see that green, yellow, and that red. And what we've done is we've gone through and we've, as they explained it to me, we virtually lit fires every 200 feet under our entire distribution system. And we studied under varying wind conditions and weather conditions the consequence of that ignition start. And what that led to is an understanding of what are our consequence tiers. So what you see is anything that's in red, those are the areas that we're most concerned with. The yellow being moderate, and the green is of lesser concern. But our entire service territory is of concern. I mean, you've been on the the High Line, you've been in that North Great Falls area, and you'll see a lot of green up there. The absence of trees will tend to lower it in this consequence model. But we also know from Eastern Montana and our experiences there, we've had some big fires and in this state. And for us to have 90,000 acre grass fires is actually fairly common. So something we have to keep an eye on. If we go for a drive in this state and we bring ourselves to the Helena area, and we chose this obviously because we're here today, but and also because, believe it or not, Helena is the division where we have the most consequence in terms of the way we're measuring that. That would account for much of this area in the northern Jefferson County area, across to Unionville, Grizzly Gulch, over to Colorado Gulch, those areas, and the density, the number of people that reside in those areas, and just given the conditions, I'm sure you all can nod your head to say, yeah, that probably makes sense. We also threw up there what the model derived for the Bozeman region, and just east towards Livingston is where much of the consequence is there.
Question here, you say you lit these fires every so often and measured. Was that, were you doing this in with the advisement and also comparing records with the state forestry and the national forestry to and like all the local fire departments to make sure that everybody, that what you were seeing was typical?
Under a virtual basis, and the information that we use is pretty much, it doesn't matter who's doing it in the utility space. Almost all the information that you're using originates from the Missoula Fire Science Lab. And that's the basis of many of these virtual models that are run. I'm going to turn this over to Nate for just a moment to speak about that whole process and what's involved in that process. It's interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, it's a good question, Commissioner O'Donnell. I'll just first say we've consulted with an outside company called Wildfire, who are fire scientists in this space, and this is kind of what they do, is work with utilities to help them understand their overall consequence tier. And the way they set up their model is they, like Jason described, they simulate a fire every 200 feet along our distribution system and let it burn unsuppressed for 24 hours. And then these are millions of fires, I should say, and it's essentially a Monte Carlo simulation. And then they take the results of that consequence, so it could be structures or timber, grasses, or area burned, and they consolidate that into, or aggregate it to, a kind of an area to help us understand it. As you don't want that, it gets too granular if it's every 200 feet. So they kind of find the median value, and then they can understand, like, this is kind of the consequence of that fire burning unsuppressed for 24 hours. As Jason described, the fuels model, the wildfire fuels model, does come from the Missoula Fire Science Lab. It's the land fire model, and the algorithm to burn using that land fire data also was developed by the Missoula Fire Science Lab.
Just a question. This is Vice President Fielder. Then you are talking about all modeling here. You're not talking about actual physical fire starts.
Yes, Vice President Fielder, that's correct. These are just all simulated fires. That does use historic weather patterns, though. So he goes back and uses 15 years worth of historic weather so they can understand the weather conditions in the local area, and uses that weather model to help simulate the fire.
That weather model and time of season, time of year?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Follow up briefly. What I was concerned about is that, like, the local, in many cases, volunteer fire departments or the local people know the situation best, characteristics that may not be reflected in official, weather type of things. I imagine you consulted with them and said, you know, what, are we missing anything here? This is what we're looking at.
Yes, Commissioner, that's correct. We definitely have touch points at a lot of the local agencies at that in those areas. We haven't shown them our results of these models yet, as they've just become available to us. But we are involved, or my team is involved locally at those meetings, and very much have those discussions about where they see risk and how we can fold those into our plans.
I would just comment that I also believe it is as much expertise as we have out there. And like from an operational perspective, we have a lot of expertise within the company too. And I think in a lot of ways, this information is validating what we maybe knew at our gut level. In some perspectives, we're listening to the SMEs, if you will, the subject matter experts, to say, let's adjust this up or let's adjust this down, depending on what their input is in order to get it right from a total model perspective. So we do have that opportunity.
Let me ask one other thing that you may cover later on, but I know a few years ago there was a fire in Yellowstone County that fire agencies were pursuing until they reached a county line or something else, and then there was a territorial dispute over, you know, you can't cross this line, and the fire got out of control in that situation. Have you gone so far as to determine in a virtual situation of a fire who's going to take care of it?
We've certainly identified those that would be involved in each of those areas, and that's part of that communication plan that I'll get to at the very end. We probably have work to do again, not only at a company level, communicating this information, because this is as useful to other agencies, and what they should be concerned about, or what they may need to defend against, as it is for us in managing our system. So this is getting to that communication plan, that engagement level at a community level, and everybody doing their part, whether it's the federal agencies that exist in Montana, the state agencies, the county level, and even to the local rural fire district. That's that engagement component that I spoke to.
Have you determined at this point whether or not there is a very comfortable level of cooperation between these different administrative agencies?
Well, I'm a product of Montana, so I would like to think that when we get everybody together, that we'll be able to achieve some level of awareness and understanding what needs to be done at a state level. Have we achieved that yet, or have I had the opportunity to see that? I have in some forums. Nate and his team have been working with agencies, and there's just an immense amount of cooperation that I'm seeing towards this issue. I haven't seen a whole lot of pushback about any of the data. It's awareness. It's going to make us better. So probably more to come on that, Commissioner. Thank you. Next slide. I knew that one would generate a little discussion. So if we carry over with what does it mean to have a dynamic dashboard? If you look at the 3 layered tiers to the left, we were entirely talking about that lowest level, which is the consequence tier. Brandy's team also provided an asset health score for our total distribution and transmission region. I'm going to get into the detail of how I'm going to show you the detail of the products of that development, not so much how it was developed. That's definitely Brandy's area. But then we lay on the daily fire weather. And what we'll look at is weather information that goes out as far as 7 days. Obviously further, but we're going to really focus on that 7 days ahead and apply that to this model to guide for our company. What to the right you'll see there is our wildfire risk tier. And again, that drives our operational strategy. And I'll talk more about this, how we choose to operate our system and when and where we choose to employ our employees on our system will be driven by that. And things will change as conditions approach extreme. Next slide. This one's pretty exciting too. And this is the one visionary component of this presentation. Everything else we're already embarking on doing or it's in our rear view window as far as being done. But this particular one we are working on. We have plans for deployment in August. And that is to situate cameras on mountaintops. Many of our, we might as well leverage Montana for what it is, the many towers that sit throughout the state. And if we employ these cameras appropriately, they're an AI technology. They're able to determine the difference between what is smoke and what is a car driving down the road and is dust. They will alert. Alert West has a call center. It alerts that call center. The call center validates that camera's alert. And once validated, it will automatically notify whoever we have on the list. Obviously, we'll be on that list, but this is our opportunity for the DNRC, BLM, local fire departments, because in the wildfire fighting world, most know that if you can get to it very early, your chances of controlling that blaze go up exponentially. So
I've seen something at one of my national things about this is that these cameras also help you triangulate exactly where a fire is. So
it will give you GPS positioning of the precise location. So the next slide, this just gives you of the pilot that we're doing. This summer, we're looking to install 12 of these cameras. And I'm happy to say with these 12, just in the pilot form, we expect to cover the good majority of our risk area with just these 12. If you go to the next slide, you can see we're in the Helena region again. A few locations. The one there with you can just make out the green circle associated with that. That's positioned on Mac Pass. And then there's another one a little lower towards Boulder. It shows the purple in there, and then it's hard to see, but there's some tan in there too. And I'm not exactly sure where that one's located. It could be Strawberry Hill near Montana City. But anyway, you can see how that works in all the areas that are colored are those ridge lines. The valleys, of course, bring a little more of an issue, but still detectable with the plume. So we will be deploying those in August timeframe, and we will reach out to as many agencies as we can to connect them to that as well. So now the next category, wildfire category that I'll go into is operational practices. Now I've talked to you about situational awareness. Realize that situational awareness drives operational practices. How we choose to work on the system. Again, we have a dedicated team, another team dedicated to evaluating every interruption and device operation that we have on our system. We want to know why. We want to know trends. We want to know what's causing those. so that we can we will perform the fix. But in addition to that, do we have a device? Do we have a piece of equipment? Do we have a sleeve type that's becoming problematic that should become part of our future maintenance plan to let's rid our system of that issue? The other thing that we're doing with operational practices, obviously we're, like I just stated, looking to mitigate system issues. We're monitoring work practices, and then it develops our system defense strategies. And I'll get into that more detail. So let's go to the next slide. Let's start with work practices. This is the work that our people do in the system. Now, this is something that we've done for many years, actually. I can remember doing this back in the age of the Modlo fire, which I think was in 2000. We were doing these type of practices with our teams. What we weren't perhaps is consistent from one area to the next. It maybe was driven by the risk factor of the operating manager of that area. But what we do now is we use our situational awareness. It tells us what tier we're in a specific location, not just broadly across the division. But if you're going to go do work up York, for example, before you go do that work during our fire season, as a crew, you need to understand what risk tier am I operating in, and what can I and can't I do, and what equipment must I have with me? How much water, and what do I do with that when I get out there? Do I have to wet down the area before I construct the work, and then after I'm done? And then do I leave somebody there to monitor up to 4 to 6 hours after the work's complete? Those are the activities that you'll see as you work your way from lower left to the upper right as we transition. And when I'm talking about this, because we're a combination utility, this is all workers that work for the company, regardless if they're doing electric work, gas work, hydro, if they're out doing surveying, whatever the case may be. If they're in the field, they need to understand their work location and the risks that they operate in. The next one, this is how we operate our system. And when we, again, driven by situational awareness, and you'll see as the wildfire risk tier escalates, so does how the safeguards and the defenses that we operate the system by also increase. Under normal operations, you're probably sitting at home and the windstorm comes through and you might see your lights blink. And those blinks are actually often reclosure actions, a device out in the field. And during that normal operating period, their goal is to keep you in power. So they're going to close, they're going to open, they're going to close, they're going to open. And if they can close and that fault is no longer apparent, they're going to close in and they're going to keep you in power. You're going to have some momentaries, but they're going to keep you in power. That's normal operations. As we escalate in fire season, we want our devices to do something different. We don't want them to close, because when they close, that means if a fault is apparent on the system, there potentially could be an ignition source. So instead of having multiple blinks, you're probably going to trip and you're going to experience an outage quicker than you would under normal operations. We have many devices on our system, both at substation out of the line, where we can control how they operate. Those defense strategies are what you see fire season operating mode 1 and 2. As we escalate, the likelihood of you seeing an outage when a fault is apparent increases. And then our last defense strategy, this is our action of last resort. When conditions are that bad and should a fire start, that the condition of that fire is uncontrollable, we will now begin to evaluate whether we should have the power off while that event is making its way across our system. That's what we call a public safety power shutoff. Again, it's an action of last resort. It's in those conditions where we just are too concerned about any fault and the potential of ignition and the potential of the consequence of that burn.
Have you had to resort to that?
I would say historically we have used PSPS, but never in a formal arena like we are today. I know that we've had situations where we're concerned about starting a fire or an issue, and we've chose to leave the power off. I know of several examples where we've had lower voltage transmission that we were concerned about the system's health and how they would do during fire season. And we've chosen to leave those lines off for long periods of time, actually. However, they didn't have any system impact or customer impact. So that's...
While we're on that topic, I have a question for you. What kind of framework do you have to operate under as you make those evaluations? Do you have a statutory framework at all that drives that?
We do not. Currently, there's nothing that says when you're under these conditions, you'll operate like this. Not external to the company. Those framework is what we've worked through and created within the formalized wildfire plan. Does that answer your question, Vice President Fielder?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you. So talking about this defense strategy hierarchy, I mean, by now we should know we start with grid hardening. We want our assets to perform as well as they can perform. It starts with that. We layer on situational awareness, not only of the operations, but also of the system. We have that enhanced power line safety setting. That's the first time I've introduced this term, at least in the speaking to the presentation. But what that is that's our ability through engineering to be able to say, we want you to trip and we want you to trip this quickly. In the power line world, we don't talk in seconds. We talk in cycles of a second. Things happen really quickly. We're looking to defend things down around 6 cycles, 4 to 6 cycles. Most mechanical breakers, if you tell a mechanical breaker to open, that breaker, just the mechanics of the breaker, takes 2 to 3 cycles to open. So we're making decisions electronically very quickly. And even our mechanical devices that don't have associated electronics operate in that same time frame and world. So things happen really quick. That's that EPSS, and we have the industry is going in a lot of really interesting directions in this arena. We're doing things where a line opens up. So vision a conductor breaks. We want safety settings that can understand that line broke, and we want to turn the power off before the energized conductor can hit the ground. That's the speed in which we're doing things within the industry. And then towered on top of that, when those defense strategies are still not enough, that's when we will evaluate PSPS. So this next slide, it's a slide I know that we'll use to help communicate to the public of how these EPSS, enhanced power line safety settings, the equipment that have been out there forever and a day, but how they work. When you have a fault, in this case, the illustration is a tree branch somehow ended up between 2 phases. And that equipment will shut that power off within a tenth of a second. Once the power is off, before we'll put the power back on, to me, it's always easy to shut the power off. What's always made me uncomfortable as an operator is when the time comes to turn it back on, right? And have you dealt with all the hazards that are out there? So the last step to that is to make sure that we do a thorough patrol. We don't have any issues on the line before we re-energize. So as we move into PSPS specifically, everybody's out there today, a little chilly, a little windy. You look at that chart up there on the left, I would say that today we were up there kind of in that winter storm category. We have a high outage probability. Although it's still pretty cool, pretty wet, low ignition probability, and a low probability of a catastrophic fire. So as the fire potential increases, this is just another way to describe what I've been describing, how you work your way to, should we be asking the question, should we be evaluating, should we be implementing PSPS on a certain forecasted day? That's what these practices allow us to do. Now, when we think about public safety power shutoff, the three elements that go into that, obviously you've got the weather and the environmental. But we're also going to want to understand for that region, how does our system perform? Was it newly constructed? Is it all steel lines? You know, what's the environment that our system is in? So we'll consider that as well. And then last but not least, we always need to understand the customer impact. You know, this is one area, I haven't talked about this much lately, but for example, where we could differ from a California or even many places in the Northwest, we have a lot of our residents have individual water wells. So if we do shut the power off, what do we do from them being able to defend their space? So all those considerations, that's just one example of a consideration. It might be if we have a sewer treatment facility associated with one of our towns, and if they don't have backup generation, will they have a problem in how they operate? So a lot of things to consider, but those are the things that we move into the consideration. Yes, sir.
So under the grid hardening, what examples just uses steel lines as reconductoring? Is the company doing much reconductoring right now?
We are. If you hold that question,
Sure.
I'm going to hit that whole
Great.
category if you'll hold that. So just to finish up with PSPS, what you're seeing on the board there is this is our strategy timeline, if you will, without necessarily time. When we're in the gray, we're kind of in normal operations. And Nate's situational awareness team, they're monitoring the environment. And let's say there's a wind event that's forecasted coming up, and it's significant enough in an area that we now believe we should be potentially assessing whether we should use PSPS. So as you move from left to right, you now move into various stages. And what those stages represent are different actions in different communications to customers. If we're considering it, we want to communicate to customers that for this wind event coming up on this future date, we're considering shutting the power off. And as we move closer to that, all the way up to go, no-go decisions, we're going to communicate with customers. And let's say in the example, we choose to implement a PSPS. Then we have what you see in 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. We also have to communicate to customers through that stage as well, the restoration stage. Most customers want to know what happened, why, how bad was it, those type of things. And we'll work our way towards re-energization. And again, as I spoke earlier, the most concerning decision up there, or the one to be the most thoughtful about, even more than de-energization, is re-energization. This next slide is really an eye chart. I'm not going to spend any time on it. What it depicts, however, is when you have on the far left, those are the various communication channels that the company will employ to get to customers, agencies, etc. And what the chart shows is who you start connecting with as you move through the PSPS event and all the communications that need to take place to keep customers informed. Moving on to the next category, interactive voice response. Yeah, interactive voice response.
Before you go on, can you go back to that previous slide for a moment? Do you have the PSC in there anywhere?
They are in the form of agencies. There's a long list. Yes. And I will tell you that certainly in the beginning with PSPS, as we move through a change curve, I've heard our CEO commit to the governor that he'll get a call. I'm absolutely committing that the Public Service Commission will know as well. Agencies like the DEQ, they'll be notified. And other agencies.
And where is that at in your matrix here? I just got a quick glance at it, and where is that?
What's that? Yeah, they're wrapped in the very bottom. If you look at it's hard for me to even see from here.
Can you zoom in on the bottom left, the key there? Yeah. So, oops, key state.
It just keeps jumping right before the very bottom, Vice President Fielder. Yeah, that target key stakeholders channel is intended for specific stakeholders such as government agencies, et cetera. Do you see that?
I do. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's actually by that symbol. There's key individuals that will have specific responsibility for those contacts. And we have those operations today. For example, if we have an incident involving the public, we have people dubbed in the company that they're going to call the Public Service Commission specific to that. But that's that whole circle with a key, bullet point with a key, wherever you see that.
Okay, I would just comment that our consumer assistance staff would probably want to be able to take that information and quickly repackage it to put it on our website or on our social media or both when there's something like that going on, to help get the word out and be able to answer those questions as they come in.
I'd say this, Vice President Fielder, from our perspective, you can see at the top from a call campaign perspective, if we're going to be putting people out, there's a possibility it's going to happen, mentioned in 1.2, we're going to want to let you know. We're gonna let the commission know when we actually have a PSPS. If we do, we're going to want to let you know again. We're going to want to let you ultimately know when we're restoring power. So you have an ability, and we're going to have many stakeholders. We're going to want to do this just so people are aware. The toughest spot for utilities has been poor communication. In essence, we were just with the governor earlier today. You saw in Colorado, the governor was unaware of how the PSPS was going to go down, and thus he became critical of the structure. We want to be able to inform you of what we're going to do. So if you get a phone call or you're asked to respond, you know what Northwestern is doing. So the communication here is critical. And I'd argue some agencies are more important than other agencies. And I would tell you, I will be calling commissioners.
I appreciate that. What I'm thinking is more granular, and that is something that our consumer assistance team can easily throw up onto the website, or our tech people can easily throw up onto the website, and distribute around the agency, maybe a link back to your site or something like that, so that when people are scrambling for that information, we can quickly get it out to folks, not just our staff, but the public. I'm concerned about.
Very good. And I've heard the concern, and I share with the concern. We want you to have that information. Our vice president of she has a very long title anymore, but our vice president over customer care, I know, and with our communications group, is with us today, and we'll make sure that we get you communication that you can turn around and help us with our message. That's exactly what we would want. So thank you, Commissioner. Vice President Fielder. Okay. So system preparedness. We just actually have a couple categories left. This is the one, Commissioner O'Donnell, that your question was pointed to. So I hope we cover it with this. Again, historically, this was our strength category. This is the stuff that we've been engaged in for some time now, a decade and a half or more. And we're proposing to stay the course. In fact, in some aspects, adjusting to what are the issues before us today. And we're performing assessments on the system. I'm going to talk to some detail about that. We're doing things like inventory and a function called LiDAR, where we're able to get the position of our conductors in space. What's their distance from the ground? The X, the Y, the Z axis. We're also use this information to target our hardening approach. No longer are the days where we're just going to time base or start here and end there. What we do is using data. We target what are our high risk elements, and let's address those first. So great asset management program to help support this strength area. We're also looking under this category again, as I've spoke to, modernizing and continue to modernize our system with electronic devices that improve our situational awareness and can control the performance of the system. Next slide. My best way to describe this slide is data, 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 data. And that's what our asset management does well with. We use that data to prioritize our approach, and we also use that data to understand and measure, are we making a difference? Why should we be spending dollars or spending effort on something that isn't achieving a target? So we use a bit of the old Six Sigma approach, where we adjust, we measure, do we meet the mark? We adjust again. And that really has been our secret sauce to targeted improvement with our assets. So when we think about the when we think about system hardening and system preparedness, we start with this static model. Now, this isn't to be confused with the dynamic model. The dynamic model has a little bit of a here and now. In this, we used the wildfire hazard potential. It's much more static. This is what we derive. It doesn't change that quickly. So we're able to establish 5-year programs off of this model. We do and did from an environmental perspective, we use the wildfire hazard potential WHP, and then we also amended that with housing density. So from and then from a system performance standpoint, we look at how many outages does a length of line have, and what are the exceptions? What's the pole age? What's its system health? It ultimately gives us that system performance risk by understanding the system health. That's the probability of it having a fault or an outage. And then in the equation, also considering the environmental risk. Ultimately, we get for every line segment on our system, and would you go to the next slide? We end up with a system wildfire risk. Now, this is a busy slide, but it's one of my favorites. Being an engineer, it's broken up into 4 tiers. And what we've done is for the distribution system, and this is the distribution example, our asset management group, we have roughly about 650 line circuits on our distribution system in Montana. And they took those 650 roughly number of circuits, and they further dissected those circuits into 34,000 line segments, small little line segments. And they risk ranked every one of those small line segments. And what you see there, all those little circles and dots, I don't want you to count them, but there are 34,000 on that chart, apparently, I've been told. So in the way you look at this chart, anything that's in the upper right-hand quadrant would have a high system risk. In other words, the performance or the health of that system is questionable. And anything on the x-axis to the far right, you're operating in an elevated environmental environment. So anything in that tier 1 has both system performance problems, and it's also operating in a high environmental risk. So what we do with all segments that are in tier 1, we throw every tool we have out of our wildfire toolbox at those particular line segments. As you move down, and I'll talk about tier 3 first, or next, is tier 3 is has a pretty decent system score, but it's still that environmental. So we're going to do less hardening activities there. And that's where we're going to put heavy on technology and heavy on situational awareness. We're going to understand the environment so we can coexist with it. And then I'll speak to tier 2. Tier 4 speaks for itself, but tier 2 is kind of the opposite. Environmental conditions, not so much. That might be what you would perhaps see in town, are those segments. The environmental conditions aren't necessarily there, but we could have system performance issues. So we're system hardening. We'll monitor it, but we won't monitor it as aggressively as tier 4. What we have here are those same charts, distribution on the left, transmission on the right. And a key bit of information from our static models, about 6% of our total distribution system is in that number one tier, that upper right. With our transmission, it's about 7.5% is in that upper right, 7.3 precisely. But to give you an idea of our percentage, we have a good amount where we want to see it down there in tier 4. Moving on. So now
I think you need just the sheer size of our system. Back about 34,000. I think if you just put this in the context of miles.
yeah, and I'm probably going to have to ask my cohorts to help me on this, but we have roughly, we have roughly close to 18,000 overhead line miles on our distribution. And we have in the order of what is 6,000. Yeah, I was close. I was gonna say 5 to 7. That's 6,000 on our transmission. Combine all those together, you can just about build a line all the way around the equator of this earth we live on. So it is a lot of system. And when you think about those small percentages of what are really high risk to us, that's why we're focusing our efforts and our spends on where we need to be from a wildfire perspective. Thank you, Brian. That was really good ad. So talking about assessments, another area I'm actually pretty proud of. Up until 2024, we've patrolled, it's been our practice to patrol 50% of our system. And when we do patrols, the term patrol, we use qualified journeyman linemen to do those patrols. And every other year, we jump to the other 50%. So over a 2-year period with qualified linemen, we're seeing 100% of our system. And we use qualified linemen because often they can repair with the issues as they find them. Some things get put on a list and a crew has to return, but if they can make the repair, they do so right then. In 2024, we started a program to use more of an engineering assessment of the other 50%. And we use that information to be able to help guide us more in those long term. So between the patrols and the assessment, we're now seeing 100% of our system overhead annually on the distribution system. On our transmission system, we've chosen to look at 100% of our lower voltages. 50 kV to 69 kV, we're going to see 100% of our system. Those are line segments. They look and act almost like a distribution line. They're usually in more heavily forested areas. They exist in those WUI areas adjacent to town. We see them as higher risk. Our 100 kV, those are the tower lines. Those are the lines that you see out there with well-maintained right-of-ways. We see them as less of a risk. We are still going to do a ground assessment on 100% of that system or systems over a 5-year period. So we'll look at 20% a year. When I compare ourselves with other utilities, I hear other utilities boasting that they're seeing their system, 100% of their system over a 5-year period. I'd be very nervous in that operating. So I really appreciate the direction the company's going.
I see the drone there. A number of years ago, there was a coordinated effort that I supported. Commissioner Raper from Idaho, I think, was the coordinator of this, having to do with line of sight regulations on drones, and that they were highly restrictive. Has that been loosened up so you can basically let the machine do the work and you don't have to just let it come home when the cows come home?
Not fully. We're still working with that. The reason why that is to be piloted is to understand and work through many of the issues you talk about. But the other thing that we have to understand is that's a lot of information, and most of those systems have to be associated with some sort of an AI technology so that AI can actually go in, review the footage, find the defects. Can you imagine sitting in front of a camera looking for the defects, you know, months and months of footage. But we are piloting that program to understand how is that line of sight. I'm going to turn this a bit to Nate. I know he's worked with and understands the line of sight restrictions that we were working on. Have they loosened?
I would say it's getting easier to get the exemptions, but you still need a file for them. And I think it's quite a process, but I know several utilities, especially in Colorado, have worked directly with the FAA to get those restrictions lifted or an exemption so that they can do that beyond visual line of sight. We haven't progressed our program to that point yet.
So your drones, do they look for just what can be seen with the naked eye, but from a distance, or do they have infrared cameras on them to detect heat on lines or any of that type of stuff?
Yeah, I would say all of the above. Yep, camera, FODAR, LiDAR, infrared, all of those technologies is what we are piloting those as we want to understand kind of what the best fit for our system is.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. So moving to the next slide, you asked specifically about wildfire hardening, and this is the slide that should cover that. What we do is think back to wherever that circle is in that number 1 category. We actually send out an engineer and they design whatever the specific solution is that's right for that segment. So I can tell you I don't know how many of you have drove over to Missoula over Mac Pass recently, but you probably saw, maybe you didn't notice, we've undergrounded that line segment that goes over Mac Pass. It was in one of those high consequence areas that we're concerned about. A fire ignites there. It's heading towards Helena. That was an example where we used underground as the mitigation solution. We've done things such as reconductoring. Sometimes it's the solution is just a change or adjustment in vegetation management. We choose to go wider or to do something different. So the solution is applied for that right segment. Again, very targeted, surgical. We're not using a program that in some instances doesn't always make sense. Every solution is engineered for that particular location and service. And thank you. Your question just described that slide. So with substation communications, I already touched on this. There's some percentages there though that I think are interesting. Our current equipment status, vast majority of our transmission distribution relays at the substation level are microprocessor already. In the distribution world, we're about 65%. So many of our efforts towards modernization is focused at upgrading to microprocessor. We even have some microprocessor that are 90s vintage, early 90s vintage, and there's a better technology out there today. And so we're upgrading old microprocessor as well as electromechanical. From a reclosure perspective, I think there's a few more than 1,000 distribution line reclosures. About 300 of those are electronic. And I'm not even sure, Brandy, if you know the number that we actually have communication connectivity to. So with that, often because when you think about maybe you're driving towards Colorado Gulch nearby here, there may not be access to communication there, but the electronic reclosure still gives us tools that a hydraulic wouldn't. It captures data. We have to go to it and download. We have to visit it. So we don't have the benefit of that data just flowing to our data centers. But it still is an advantage over the hydraulic. So we have programs to address and to modernize that equipment. Vegetation management, again, I've been speaking to, this is a strength area, especially as compared with Northwest Utilities. Proud of the work they've done over the years. Obviously what we're doing with vegetation management is we're addressing line conflicts. And what's different here probably than, again, the differences, why you have to be careful that you don't get locked into a standard of care that doesn't make sense. In California, they actually have rules or laws that only allow the utility to trim certain trees in certain locations to a 1-year growth rate, which means they have to return to that same tree year over year over year over year. Where our programs are targeted, we look to something more along the 5 to 7 year target. We do have cycle busters, but we know where they're at, and our programs address those like that. The other thing that I'm really proud of with, and Nate also leads the vegetation management team and has for some time and this was supported by asset management, but just the number of partnerships that they've developed. The hazard tree program several decades ago would have been unheard of, to the thought of the utility cutting trees down outside of their right of way. And the progress that they made, even with that concept, has carried over to the private sector. And also the mountain pine beetle infestation. Some people early on in the infestation were concerned about losing their trees. And then they realized that those trees are already dead. They just don't know it. And there was a mindset change with that infestation. So with every tragedy, there's always a bit of silver lining, and I guess that's it. But many of our private property owners adjacent to our right-of-ways have changed their perspective about working with us. And then, so in this space, we're going to continue to deal with that. Getting back with cooperation with agencies. Our folks are talking with their folks of, it doesn't make a lot of sense if we have that cleanest right away and the adjacent forests are a mess and they're not of good health. So where can we align our efforts where we're doing work adjacent to their work and our right away and their forests are better health after we leave? So a lot of those opportunities, this next slide just shows our existing programs prior to the expense deferment treatment that we received in the last rate review. That's represented in the dark blue. The additional programs that we're going after to address our concerns within vegetation management are those other programs. We talked to much of that spend is to actually go after those targeted areas that are in the high risk tiers. The fall zones or that hazard tree program, the risk tree program, it is shown there in orange. And then last but not least, we're also in this space wanting to implement technology. In fact, we've done this in the past. We worked with one vendor to give us satellite imagery that we're able to detect trees, fall-ins, grow-ins that were adjacent to our lines and actually are detected through satellite. We're still piloting. We just moved to a different vendor to see what they have to offer, but we are playing in that space as well. Next. This slide is just an illustration, if you will, by bar graphs of we're increasing our effort. In the historical state, we were operating about 30 tree crews and equipment across our service territory annually. We've nearly doubled that with these plans. You got to have pictures, and there's some really unique equipment that we've are utilizing on our right-of-ways to make vegetation removal more efficient. We're getting, I've heard Scott Bernhardt, our manager of our vegetation programs, talk about, it's all about as many trees as you can take care of for the dollar. And that's how he looks at it. So many tools that we're using there, from helicopter operated saws that side trim and remove hazard trees to giraffes that are long billed and walk the right away and address problems. So I think I covered this. This was the AI dash. This is the satellite imagery pilot that we now have going with the vegetation group. So last category, and it's a short one, but it's probably the biggest lift in my opinion. We're as a company, as a community, as a state, we're not going to be effective until we truly understand the risks associated with wildfire and the consequences that it could have on our state. And what we don't want is to sit on our laurels, sit on our hands, and wait for the event that we're then driven to be irrationally responsive, like I've seen in other and heard of in other jurisdictions. So there's a lot to do in this, and these last couple of days are just barely going to scratch the surface. I appreciate Vice President Fielder's comments about making sure that the commission's communicated with and understanding what we're doing and why we're doing it. We have a wide list and a long list to engage into partnerships, into communication, and that's before we even really get to our customers. There's just so many to engage into this subject. So what we've done is we have developed a communication strategy, if you will, and I would say it's even beyond communication. The actual title of the strategy is called a stakeholder readiness strategy, because communication would imply we just need you to know, and then that's it. Where I truly believe where we need to be with this is a level of readiness where we not only need to be communicated with, but we need to engage in each other's perspectives on what this issue could become for the state. We've broke our groups into these 6 groups. We've got our NWE employees. We've started there already. We're developing training, and all 1,600 of our employees will be trained on this subject to be able to speak to it, understand it, and know it. Certainly a relative difference by their classification, but we are targeting that group first. And then we're also creating a prioritized approach with the other groups. For example, we're here today, government bodies. We spoke to the government. I've been before the ETEC committee at the legislature. We'll continue to hit those forums. We have many local governments. We'll start with the local governments in the high impact areas. I told you Helena was a high impact area. Well, certainly we need to be up talking to the city commissioners, the county commissioners related to Jefferson County, Broadwater, and Lewis and Clark. As far as the agencies, a lot of work to do there. We did meet earlier today as well with DEQ. There's many other agencies to work with. We're talking about doing things such as holding wildfire summits for those agencies so that we can engage and understand each other's efforts and hopefully enhance the coordination and cooperation, Commissioner O'Donnell, that you alluded to. We have in the general community, what we're going to start with is the high impact areas and get to those customers and try to educate. Certainly we'll want to move through all of our customer base and communities, but we'll start there. So a lot of work to do in this space in general. I'm going to skip this slide. It's great reading. I'll leave it to you. In general, I guess this slide sums it up. It's pretty simple from a communication standpoint, but we really do need to raise the awareness of our communities of this wildfire is an issue. I think the company in partnership with others, there's legislation and policy development that could help us all, not only as a utility, but as a customer. What can we do to help those agencies with improving overall forest health? We went through a century of suppress. And what we've been left with is forests that are struggling from a health perspective. The natural order of burn and clean them up has been suppressed. So there's a lot to do in that front as well. I mean, I'm a private homeowner here in Montana, and my insurance options were recently adjusted for me because I live in a WUI. So this will touch each and all of us that reside in Montana or do business here. Public safety power shut off. The key thing that I would pass on to you as the commission is I don't want this to ever be the leading message, because if you dive right in and talk about public safety power shut off without the backdrop of everything else that we do with wildfire and all the defense strategies that we employ before we get to that last resort, we're doing ourselves and everybody else. We're unjust when we do that. So we need to keep in mind that that's just a defense. It's a big one, and it's gonna cause some emotional concern, I'm sure, the first time we employ it. But it's easier to get through when you truly understand why and everything else that led up to that. These slides I'm gonna just hit real quick, and I'm not gonna read through a lot of these. I'll ask you to do that. 2023 was for us. We came out of 2022. And thank you. We were allowed to defer expenses, and that was a big part in us being able to play in this space and to do what we need to do as other utilities are. For us, 2023 was a year of development, and it was a year of going on a fishing trip here at the end of the weekend, and it was packing up all the stuff, getting ready to go on the trip. And that's what we did in 2023. We continued doing the things that we had been doing historic, and we prepared for an incredible adjustment up in everything that we're going to do from effort. 2024, this is one quarter, and I'm impressed, and I'm incredibly proud of the employees of this company and all that can get done when we prepare and we go after it. There's a long list, and this is just the first quarter achievements. I know I won't be able to cover the year end in one slide. So we're doing a lot in this space, and we're committed to keep doing a lot. So next slide. On the bottom here, you'll see, and I will have, I've talked to Cindy Fang. We'll get a dozen or so. If you think it should be more, just let us know. We'll get some printed copies so that you have them at your disposal here at the commission. They'll arrive later in the week. But until then, if you're so inclined, this 2024 version of the Wildfire Mitigation Plan is now posted on our website, and you can find it there. And with that, I'm going to turn this back to Brian for some final comments.
Yeah, the interesting thing is you've watched what happened to other utilities here. This has become a number one risk in the utility space. And from our perspective, at the federal level, we're working with other utilities. What can we do at the federal level? And strict liabilities certainly be tough, but we're looking at, is there FEMA help? Is there other ways that we can help mitigate this risk? Because this is, as you've seen, and what's happening in Hawaii, a utility similar size as ours potentially could go into bankruptcy as a result of what's happening there. So obviously we're focused on this. What can we do at the federal level, the state level? Working with the commission, what can we do to help mitigate our risk as a company? Because obviously it can impact our shareholders will certainly acknowledge that, but ultimately this is going to be higher cost for customers. If we had cost more to raise capital because we don't have a strong financial company as a result of our risks here, it's going to be a problem for our customers as well. Another thing I'd say about a lot of discussion around PSPS because it's a different operating system. And I think it has a bit of a negative connotation because when you read the papers, 160,000 customers in Colorado, we're out power for 4 days. And so the first question is, well, geez, the winds were only blowing for the first day. Why was I out of power for 4 days? Well, it's back to Jason's point about you got to make sure your system's clear before you re-energize. What the citizens didn't know, and we know from discussions with Xcel, they had over 100 of their power lines, poles were down, and they were pretty certain they would have started a fire in those 100-mile-an-hour winds had they not done a PSPS. So the thing you can't tell is what it did save in terms of potential loss of not only physical assets, but loss of life. And obviously Xcel's dealt with this in 2 different fires now. So huge issue for us. The other thing I'd say though, and Jason talked about all of those different line segments and our ability to monitor those. First of all, we have, less than 400,000 electric customers in the state. So we're not going to read headlines of hundreds of thousands of people impacted, but even 10, 15, 100, 200 customers, we're going to be concerned about their ability to operate if they don't have power for a number of days. So we're going to try to be very, very focused on how we deal with PSPS. We're not going to do it on a full state basis, but nonetheless, those are customers that are going to be affected. And we're going to take that very seriously if in fact we pull the trigger from a PSPS perspective. So it's all about risk mitigation. It's not just about providing risk mitigation for the utility. It's about providing risk mitigation for those customers who live in those areas where that fire could occur. And so we're certainly working hard. I think one thing, Jason has done a fantastic job leading this. He talked about his group, asset management, communications, but this has been an all hands on deck effort by the company. I can look at each one of the executives. They've had some role, one form or another, thinking about this, but the numbers of people throughout this organization who are focused on this is extremely high. And I will reiterate the amount of success we've seen in terms of dealing with the areas that Jason said we needed some help on, situation awareness, communication. What we've done in just a 4-month period is extremely impressive. And I'll tell you, our board obviously is very concerned about this issue, and they've had deliverables by April, which is a recent board meeting. This plan was ready to go. We said we wanted to release it after we saw you. July. We're going to show them situational awareness, all the tools of technology that we've put in place in a very short order. Jason talked about some of those. And fire seasons, as you know, it's already here now in terms of the expanded fire season. So really proud of what the organization has done to deliver this in such a short order in terms of the improvement over our last plan. But obviously we got to execute too. So stay tuned and trust me, we don't want any surprises for you. If we start going down this path, you'll be getting notification. But I think in fairness to Vice President Fielder's question, other aspects of the staff and others, how you wanted to be communicated to, we need to have a dialogue with you because maybe we aren't necessarily matched up perfectly. And that's part of talking about the plan. It's going to be a living and breathing document that will need to change over time based upon feedback from you and others. And we'll be doing that as part of this process. And hey, thanks for taking nearly 2 hours of your time today to listen to us.
Thank you very much. Let's take a 10-minute break. I have a question that I want to follow up, a couple of questions. I think Commissioner Bukacek. Can we just take about a 10-minute break right now? Okay. We'll be back in a few.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. One is question based purely on legal curiosity. So when you're going to utilize the use of the cameras to detect heat or smoke, are you using your own assets or are you going to obtain easements for those?
Yes, President Brown, the cameras that we intend to use, we'll purchase the cameras ourselves and install them. As Jason described during the presentation, the AI, if you're wondering about the privacy and security of those, no, okay.
No, I'm curious as to are you using your own equipment to install those? Or are you going to use like Forest Service property or
will
telecommunications property?
I understand. It'll be mostly our towers that they're installed on, our communication towers. There are a few locations that we're considering in using, a tower that's installed by somebody else, but mostly Northwestern Energy assets.
Okay, that was just pure curiosity, frankly. But can I have you turn to? I'll direct this to you, Jason. Slide number 49.
I'm there,
Okay.
President Brown.
So Jason, you stated in the early part of your presentation that I think your quote was, this is not necessarily a utility issue, but a state issue. So I'd like to pick up on that thematically. And you list on this slide that under the working together title, you list that Northwestern Energy will, paraphrase here, implement legislation and policies to support wildfire mitigation efforts through legislation and policy development. And so I didn't catch your presentation at ETEC, and I apologize for that, but what are you looking to do at the state level, at least in terms of trying to mitigate some of this wildfire risk? Right, Ms. Bird?
Yeah, thank you, President Brown. This legislative session, if there's a means for us to limit some of the risk, be it non-economic, be it punitive damages, some sort of risk mitigation from that perspective would be helpful. It's early innings in terms of what else could come out of that process. But we are looking at other states that have put in place legislation that have helped them. Utah is an example. Might not be perfect for what we're trying to accomplish in Montana, but we're certainly looking around at other states. And as I mentioned earlier, we think we're going to need help from a federal perspective, a state perspective, and other means to mitigate this risk appropriately.
So it sounds like you're going to work on tort reform type?
We're gonna see what we can accomplish, but somehow, and I know that's a heavy lift, but that's something we're gonna have to look at.
All right, Mr. Chairman, no more questions from this end.
Just a comment, and I want to echo what Chair O'Donnell said. Excellent presentation. And I've been around engineers since I was a child. My father was an engineer, and I love the rational thinking and the pragmatism. And I also delight in the things that you all get excited about. The things, that most of us are just really appreciate that you get excited about those things and take care of them. So just very, very well done. Appreciate you. Your enthusiasm for what you're doing and your pleasure in the program just shows in the way you present. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Let me, before calling on Vice President Fielder, is that something that she brought to my attention a long time ago has a bearing on this. And so a prelude to this, she, with the American Lands Council, was pointing out the differences between state-managed forestry and federally managed forestry. And the pictures that I saw indicated a very stark difference on there. And so at some point, I'd like to find out, I'm not precluding her question, but in terms of my earlier thing about cooperation from federal and state agencies, whatever. People wanting to protect their turf or trees or whatever, and I think that there could be a real problem. But at any rate, I wanted Vice President Fielder to know that she made a point with me a long time ago, and I remembered it. So, no, Vice President Fielder, did you have questions for these eminent people?
I do, and thank you, Chairman O'Donnell. Yes, this is a sophisticated plan, and I do appreciate the good work that's been done on this. I had a question about the cameras, but I think President Brown beat me to that. So it just occurred to me that if those cameras are going to benefit other agencies and other the public at large, that maybe some cost sharing should be considered on those. But my question I will go to does address the Forest Service issue. Particularly Western Montana has an incredible amount of forest land managed by the U.S. Forest Service. And I'm glad to hear that you've been having some success working with them. That's good news. I'm wondering if you're familiar with and have been able to identify the areas that are at greater risk due to the administrative intent for those areas. And what I mean by that, in case that's a new term for anybody, is that the U.S. Forest Service has been aggressively increasing its use of fire to reduce vegetation in lieu of logging and grazing. And what's happening on the ground is, from my observation and other reports that I've seen, is that there may be a small series of fires caused by lightning during a summer storm that may be just a little small puffballs of smoke, maybe an acre or two, or just a few acres in size. And because of the administrative intent, what is happening is the incident command is setting up firefighting boundaries that encompass thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of acres, sometimes even more than that, of area to be burned as a way of treating that forest, and using those small lightning starts as kind of the impetus to be able to do that. And I know that this has been done in some areas and caused a great amount of damage, both to homes and lives and livelihoods. And I did ask some Forest Service former retired administrators about this recently, and they said that utilities had also been severely damaged just under some of these administrative intent fires. So I'm wondering if you've been able to identify these planned burn areas, and has the Forest Service disclosed that to you? Are you aware of it? Are you stepping up wildfire mitigation efforts to reduce vegetation the best you can around utilities in those areas where there is administrative intent to not only let it burn, but actually to intentionally burn more of it once they get an opportunity to, with when the small fires are started, and they go in and start lighting fires, miles away from the actual fire?
Thank you, Commissioner. To the detail of your question, I'm not aware as an operator that we have a list of the areas as you've described. I know that they have planned burn areas where they actually ignite and they have a targeted burn, and we are made aware of those, and it normally avoids and doesn't encompass our power facilities. So I do have a gentleman, though. He's the director of asset management. Randy Hellwinkle actually reports to John Carmody, and he works the most with our agencies on these matters. So I'm hoping he can shed a little light on your question.
Fellow Vice President, I'm not sure about your comments in regards to fires and letting those continue to burn. However, we have been working with the Forest Service and overlaying their hazard risk or their risk profiles, as we showed you earlier, using Cloudfire and that. So we've been working with those on areas where they've proposed mitigation, already started mitigation, or potentially future mitigation, and then working with them to lay their prioritization models over the top of our prioritization models. And then it went as far as to share with them, here are areas in 2024 and 2025. We will be doing our hazard or our forest risk mitigations, what we'll be doing in those areas to overlay those with their local area district managers. And it's all about fuels mitigation. As Jason said, trying to make sure both of us are working together in the areas where possible. Obviously, they have slightly different drivers for theirs. Watersheds are there a little bit higher than some of our basics in our static model. But yes, we have seen how they're prioritizing and breaking down the forest areas and overlaid those with ours and trying to sync up at that level right now. But fire and that I can't speak to going ahead and whether they're going to let this burn or not.
And specifically, I can tell you that we haven't been notified of any of those plans as you described it, Commissioner Fielder, that to let us know if a fire starts in this area, we're gonna let it burn to this size. I have no awareness of any of those plans or policies.
Okay, well, I would just suggest that you put it on your radar and look into it, because it is happening very aggressively these last few years. And an example in my area, I saw it on the ground. I was meeting with Incident Command, and I everyone was pretty puzzled at why they had drawn the fire line some like 10 or 15 miles away from the little fires up in the mountains. And at the end, I met with the incident commander and the district ranger about that, and they said it was the administrative tent of, I believe, the regional supervisor that directed where they would fight the fire from, and not just fight it, but they lit it. They used intentional burning from 15 miles or some estimate. I don't know the exact mileage, but some great distance away from the fire to burn out that area. And the presentation I saw recently was a business called Wildfire Pros, and I think their website is wildfirepros.org. And they documented a fire in New Mexico where drones were used to ignite areas several miles away from where the natural fire had started, and they've been able to graphically depict it in their presentation through aerial satellite photos and that type of thing. And it's a growing concern, I think, for those that have learned about it. But from a utility standpoint, I think it would be important for you guys to find out if any of that administrative intent would affect any of your utility areas, and if there was a need to put a higher priority in those areas.
Thank you, Commissioner. We will we'll follow up. That's good advice.
Anything additional, Commissioner Fielder?
No, that covers it for me. Thank you very much for the presentation today. I found it very informative and appreciate the work that you're doing on the plans.
Indeed. Commissioner Brown?
It's a sort of a point of personal interest, but Commissioner Fielder raises a good point. I'd just make the point that as someone who grew up in agriculture, we have seen over the years where federal land management agencies have taken purposeful actions to drive livestock off of public lands. And I would suspect that the risk of wildfires in Montana has increased because a wildfire mitigation tool known as livestock grazing is being removed from national forests and BLM land.
Thank you. I have a series of questions prepared for me by someone else, but is there a specific example of wildfire liability treatment in other states that you're looking to adapt for Montana? I guess this might be the tort or the legislative.
Yeah, we're looking at all the states from a legislative perspective. I mentioned Utah. That's recent legislation there. That's, like I said, it's not necessarily perfect for Montana, but it's a good start. And so we'll continue to evaluate that, see what we can do from the federal perspective. And by the time we show up at the legislative session in January, we'll have some thoughts.
It says, how do you balance the interests of property owners and insurance companies in regard to a cap on damages or strict liability?
It's a great question. And I think that's one of the things here, if from a legislative standpoint, if we can get some relief on our end, I think it's also going to help homeowners in the same regard at the end of the day. And I think one of the issues, the utility industry and the insurance industry working together to actually allow people to get, particularly those that are in the WUI, as Jason described, actually get coverage. I think this is going to be a bigger problem. Matter of fact, one of the issues for us too, from a rising cost perspective, is it's difficult to even get insurance coverage from a wildfire perspective. That and we continue to work with our carriers on this particular issue and coming up in a renewal. It's I think ultimately this country is going to have to look at this hand in hand to protect the utility industry and homeowners through this process.
I expected our future state auditor to ask about the insurance liability questions, but you know, you can only lead a horse so far. Anyway, so talked about your current insurance coverage. Something I was at recently, they talked it is a major problem because for every dollar of insurance, it costs 80 cents a premium. So you're not really benefiting very much.
I'm smiling at our CFO in the back of the room. I'm not sure she would care for me to publicly announce what coverage we have, but I would tell you that versus our peers, we have had very good coverage in the past. We'd like to maintain that. But the ability to maintain it and the cost, if we could maintain it, is going to be much, much higher. So it's something we need to look at. But what we've learned here is again, nice thing about the utility space, we all talk to each other. There's really not a competition, if you will, from a service territory perspective. So, but we can learn from one another. That's one thing we've learned is we've had in a pretty conservative nature from a company perspective and a risk perspective. It's probably why we carried more coverage than others of our size. But thank God we have in light of the current circumstances, but trying to maintain that is something that will continue to be a challenge for us.
Well, some of these catastrophic fires, went far beyond what any insurance would pay. And I'm sure insurance companies and where things are way out of hand, that actuarially they're going to withdraw from the market or price it too high. Have you seen that? Is the market for insurance, is it tightening a lot on that? Is insurance really available?
I think insurance companies are looking at two things. What's the risk of a wildfire in that particular state? And what are the policies from a legislative standpoint? And how is the judiciary treating such policies? And obviously, I'm going to pick on a particular state. I think the state of Oregon is going to have a tough time getting insurance coverage.
I read the book recently, the California Burning, about the PG&E difficulties they had. And one of the things that struck me was that the author of the book was a writer for the Wall Street Journal and did a lot of cataloging, very good research on this, indicated that some of the major causes for PG&E not taking care of their infrastructure was that they had their own profit incentive, like any corporation does, but also there was a lot of pressure from the governor to follow his environmental policies. I almost used an adjective that I shouldn't use here. but also the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, was also echoing the governor's things, so that there was a lot of pressure on the company to not take care of their aging infrastructure, a lot of deferred maintenance. So my question is, what type of support do you have from the government of the state of Montana, particularly our governor?
I mean, I'm going to say two things in that regard. I think Catherine Blunt, I believe, is the author's name. She still writes on these issues for the Wall Street Journal. And having read the book, I agree with your assessment. I do think, you know, this is perfect softball to me, Commissioner. I appreciate it. I mean, this company, we want to balance reliability, affordability, and sustainability. I believe this commission has supported us in that regard. And I do think if you lean on any one of those three legs of that stool too much, the other two are going to suffer. And I will say, I believe California suffered from that. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think in terms of anything from an energy policy perspective, we appreciate the governor's support. This is a new topic. I mean, it's not necessarily a new topic over the last several years, but it's a new topic to bring to his attention. We first meeting with him was today on this very topic. But in light of this issue, and much like first real meeting with you guys, one thing I would say from the commission's perspective, two things I've also seen from a support perspective from the commission. Obviously, Jason mentioned it, the ability from us to defer expense allowed us to really increase what we're spending on this program as we need to. The second thing, think back to the wildfire, and we did, as Jason pointed out, a lot of work from hazard tree perspective in our forest management program. We talked about that with the commission, and the commission supported us and really wanted to make sure we spent those dollars. And so from my perspective, the commission's provided us support. And I think from a balance of those three legs of those stools, I feel comfortable the commission support us in that regard.
And I remember some of the difficulties. Your vice president of transmission was talking to me about taking out some of the diseased trees from very, very steep areas, mountainous areas with helicopters and whatever. And see, I do remember things, Mike, you know, that you say, and some of the great difficulties involved in that. One thing that I'm puzzled about, in your latest application for rate increase, you had a large portion having to do with wildfire mitigation, and it came to, like, from my estimate of what I read there, it was like an additional like 80 people to the company. Anyway, it was a lot of money involved in it, and that was not part of the stipulation. Yet, I assume you're not going to do another rate case for another 5 years or something like this, certainly not next year. How are you going to accomplish all of the things on here, then the next level things, without the money from that the commission allocated?
Mr. Byrd, I would just caution you to be very careful and circumspect in your answers if you're going to.
Well, I
presenting
further
things
to
to the
that,
commission coming up.
that's not in front of us right now, so that's I think I'm okay.
I would say this, Commissioner, we have certainly pointed out in terms of the amount of level of we're investing as a utility and need to invest, and this is just one of those areas we need to continue to invest. We would be likely coming in more frequently for rate reviews.
Okay, very good. There is one additional question on here, which, okay, it says, how do you balance capping liability, damages, or negligence with the thought that the state may be impairing a property owner's right to recover damages from a negligent party?
I think that's a fair question. One thing I didn't say in my answer regarding this before is, in essence, for us to expect some sort of limitation on liability, we have to live with a certain standard of care. And that's one thing we as an industry, Jason talked about, had a great slide on that. We want to have a standard of care that we have to live by. If we don't live by it, then that said limitations aren't in effect. If we're truly negligent, then we should be held accountable for that. But if we live by a certain standard of care, then we'd expect to have those liability limitations in effect. The issue that we're seeing in some cases is you're giving a jury giving a decision to the folks making the claims at this point in time before it's even been proven that the utility started the fire. I mean, we just need to come up with something that works but we have to have our role in that as well.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the frightening outgrowths of the PG&E situation was that the city county of San Francisco wanted to take over that portion of PG&E, and obviously the city county of San Francisco has shown no acumen to managing their own affairs. I could just see them handling the electricity supply for the city.
No comment, Commissioner.
I thank you. Any further, Vice President Fielder, any follow-up?
No, thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Very, very illuminating. I really appreciate it. And you said this was the first time you've come to us. Actually, in the previous rate case was the program of widening the paths to the trees. I remember that and was extremely supportive of that, and I'm glad to see that you brought that and took care of that.
That's a fair comment, Commissioner. I guess in fairness, the rate review and the time before we did, it's the first time to actually walk through our plan in this type of setting. If I could, just one final comment, I want to acknowledge Commissioner Bukacek's comment. Obviously, the passion these people have for their roles, but I'll tell you, you will find that in a lot of Northwestern Energy employees, and that's why it makes it a great place to work.
Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it. Meeting is adjourned.